Hello, Cogs community, the steampunk community. This is Joseph Kennedy, and I'm going to do a presentation on professions of the 19th century and an intro to genealogy. I'm hoping I can share my screens. Okay, that looks good to me. All right, I'm going to start off here as I'm a member of the New York 19th Century Society. We're an organization that talks about things regarding the 19th century. We have some events in June. We usually have And we usually have a picnic in June. I don't know if that'll happen this year because of everything that's going on. And I'm going to talk about some of the professions in the 19th century and an intro to genealogy. So, genealogy is the study of our ancestors, and I think most people know that. Here's one of my great great grandparents who lived in New York City. He came from Ireland, Oliver Anderson, and he was tricky to track down because there's another Oliver Anderson in Brooklyn. So, he was actually a member of the Northern Army, the New York 79th Highlanders. Um, during the Civil War, and they were actually a kilted regiment. And I'm going to just um, and I'm going to try to look at the chat as well. So if anybody can't hear me, can you just let me know? Um, and yes, Victoria, I will let you know about the picnic. We don't know when we'll have it. Hopefully, we can reschedule for the fall if the spring doesn't happen. But it's in Central Park. Um, and so Oliver Anderson came to New York in the mid 1800s. He joined the Union Army of the New York 79th Highlanders. And this is an example of the New York 79th Highlanders. You can see their dress uniforms were kilted. My ancestor was in Company E, so he may not have had a kilt because they started to switch over to trousers. And if somebody could just put in the chat whether or not they can hear me. Okay, I see Super Dylan says she can. So they were actually a kilted regiment in their dress uniforms, and you can see those sporrans were huge. This is not my ancestor. This is an actual historical picture, though, and there are some reenactment groups that do the 79th Highlanders. He might have actually worn pants because he was in Company E, and they started to move over because to trews or trousers because you need less fabric for trousers than a kilt. Um, so if you're going to start genealogy and you're doing your own, one of the big questions is where to start. Um, you want to start with what you know, and you want to start with the names, the relationships, the date of births, deaths, and marriages, where people lived, their religions, fraternal affiliations, the groups they may have belonged to, occupations that they had, and the nationalities. And as we know, especially in a city like New York, different parts of the city have large portions of people from different countries and nationalities. So Chinatown, for example, Little Italy, um, Queens and Brooklyn all went through. Astoria was primarily Greek, and yes, that is a very big sporn. Um, so it's a good idea to collect information about the people closest to you first. Even start with yourself, or start with your parents. And that's a challenge for some people who also are adopted. That they may have more of a challenge to find their birth parents, although uh, their adopted parents, you can start with them as well. And start out asking questions, start a conversation, especially with older people. It is much easier than to ask them facts. You'll say to your grandmother or your great uncle, and you'll ask them, "Oh, what about so and so?" And they'll, "I don't really know." But if you start to ask them, "Did you ever go here? Did you ever go there? Have you ever been to this place?" And they'll start telling stories that will be great information. And you can ask them if they can be recorded. You might want to wait until you got more information to ask that. But it is an adventure. It's a detective game. And I've spent many, many days in libraries and different places like municipal centers for records. Um, so that's where you start. Some of the software you can use is Family Tree Maker. Ancestry.com is a pay-for service. It is, however, probably the best of them. I don't always have an active subscription. I do have one now. I'll try to show you some of those records. It does cost, and it depends what kind of records you want, but they are actually the best. However, if you don't want to spend that money, there are a lot of other um, websites, and there are software you can use to track it. And I'll show you some of my family tree. Um, and keep it in files. I separate my stuff along directories, which I keep on Dropbox and Sync. So the Kennedys, Smiths, the Joneses, in my case, the Hawks, the Mecklers, sometimes by decade, sometimes by document type. Um, if you really, really get into it, then you're going to probably want to attend professional genealogy lectures. I am not a professional genealogist. I'm an enthusiastic amateur, but I have attended things for professional genealogists. But keep notes. And one of the reasons you want to do that is you'll search for a record. And if you don't keep notes, then you'll search for that record again. And especially if it's a red herring, a Kennedy that wasn't one of my Kennedys, it's frustrating. Oh, I've gone to this person 6 times already. Um, and where to find information. Letters, which of course nowadays is becoming less common, diaries, photos, obituaries. Gravestones often have excellent information about when people born, when people die. The cemeteries can often give you everybody that's interred there, which leads you to other ancestors and family Bibles, family stories, any other family records. You know, that box that somebody keeps in the closet with all those things like note cards and wedding invitations. Those are really good places to start um, because there'll be more than just names and dates. There'll be events. So, like I said, Ancestry is a good one. Fold3 is a good one. This also costs money and it has excellent, excellent military records. FamilySearch.org is free. I would start there, in fact, if I was to do some research. Ellis Island and Castle Garden. Ellis Island started in the late 1800s. None of my ancestors came through there, but Castle Garden was Ellis Island before Ellis Island. And there's some good stuff. Google Books, actually. Google Books is an enormous resource, and they have books that go into the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So sometimes you can search for something, and I found some of my hawks in Wisconsin because they're mentioned in an historical book that's on Google Books. Newspapers are an excellent source. You will see in older newspapers, they will have events, and it's kind of like Facebook is today, or Twitter, or Instagram, where I have situations where my great aunt and uncle were visiting my grandfather and grandmother for Christmas, even though they lived in the adjacent town. Like one lived one town over, but there's a little note in the local newspapers saying Mr. and Mrs. Harry Corsilius will be the guest of Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Kennedy for the holiday. And literally that would be the equivalent of you tweeting nowadays, hey, I'm going over to, you know, Uncle Joe's for fultonsearch.org. This is a tremendous website. This fella did it on his own. He started with just Fulton postcards, and then he started doing newspapers. It's fully searchable. I would go in there and look at their clues. Um, and um, Ellis Island closed, I believe, in the 30s. It opened in, I think, 1892. But it was this is a question on the chat. It was the premier place for most people to come into the United States. However, um, it it was not the only place. A lot of people came in Philadelphia, and obviously people coming, especially from China, came into ports in the Pacific. Um, so look there first because that was by far the largest port. People came in from down south. People across the Canadian border. Some of my ancestors did, and I'll talk about them a little later. Uh, Here's an example of my grandfather. Lawrence Aloysius Kennedy. He was also known as the Flying Irishman, and he's kind of in a steampunk outfit. You can see him with his flying hat on. At least I hope you can. Flying cap on. He was a newsreel cameraman for Fox Movietone News, and you could see Larry Kennedy's Sky Shooter par excellence. He did all of Fox Movietone's aerial work, and it was kind of dangerous back then. He had quite a lot of things that were dangerous happen to him during his Movietone newsreel career, and we'll see him a little later on. Um, so, what's in a name? I'm going to tell you names will change in records, and we do it ourselves. There will be aliases, there'll be nicknames. There are a lot of cultures where, um, especially the Romance cultures, Italians, Portuguese, uh, Spaniards, where especially the women, huge numbers of Maria, and nobody goes by Maria. They use their middle name because there's so many Marias. I have two friends whose first names are actually Maria, and I didn't know till I got wedding invitations that they were Marias because they used their middle name. Liz or Lizzie, Cedric Ogden Hawkes, who's my grandfather, he was listed as Adri Ogden Hawkes in a record because the C and the E looked like a script A. So look for alternative spellings. My mom was originally Rosalie Winifred, and now she's Rosewin, and it's been spelled all of those ways through through it. So, and Peggy and Margaret is another one. And different cultures also have different nicknames. Some of them, like the Russians, kind of easier when you find those names because if they use a nickname, it's consistent. Um, Whatever you're called, if you're, Alexander, your nickname is always the same. But some of the other places, especially Europeans, and then some countries adopted, and some people adopted anglicized names. We know that. Um, like Meckler is my grandparents' name, great grandparents, but it was originally Mickler when they first came to the United States. And you can see the records changed in like 10 years. They were actually in New Jersey. They were iron miners in the iron mines in New Jersey at Oxford Furnace, which you can still see today. The furnace is rebuilt and it's there. Um, and I will tell you about the Ellis Island myth. You can send a message in chat if you've heard the myth or you've seen The Godfather, that names were changed at Ellis Island. My family's name was changed at Ellis Island. That really almost never happened. And one of the reasons is all the ships coming in were required to have manifests with the people's names. So if the name was misspelled, either there's a transcription error or it happened in the country they came from. And very often immigrants were coming from a place that was not their native language. A lot of people would go, for example, to England or to Germany, and they weren't from England or Germany. And if you're from a landlocked country, you need to travel to a country with a port in order to leave. Um, so if your ancestor's name is changed, and it's very, very common, um, it it wasn't at Ellis Island, but it could have been changed right after or right before Ellis Island, or they could have just started using it. Many records for Italians, for example, were also Joseph will be Giuseppe, and the fellow won't ever use it, and the family will use the name in census records, which, by the way, is happening this year. So any of you who didn't fill out your census, go and do that because there's an ancestor 72 years from now who will want to see where you were. Um, so this is Cedric Ogden Hawkes. This is You can see that the Hawks is spelled without the e, and almost always it is spelled with the e. This is a World War I draft registration card, but he was transcribed as Adri Ogden Hawkes. Um, this CE was interpreted as an A by the transcriber. I will say this, they are really good at doing it. A lot of these records are done by volunteers, almost all volunteers. The Mormons are particularly good at this. They have the best resources in the world for genealogy. It's part of their culture. And I have been to Mormon learning centers to research. Um, if you haven't, and you're going to get into it, I encourage you to do. There's a lot of them around. I've been to the ones in New York City and New Jersey, and they don't proselytize while you're doing genealogy research. They're very friendly and very helpful. Um, and Historical societies, your local historical societies, or where your ancestors came from, that's a good place. If you, for example, had family up in Boston or you had them out in a rural part, a lot of times those historical societies will know where the records are. The newspapers, the New York Times is fully indexed back to 1851, so you can do a word search. And this helped me, I'll show you later on, with Cedric Ogden Hawkes and his two brothers. Uh, for New York City residents and people who had ancestors in New York City, the Municipal Archives on Chambers Street is excellent. They don't charge you to use stuff, but you do have to pay for printouts. So you can go and use their microfilm machines. Um, Courts and probate records, if you find them. And overseas, a lot of countries, especially Ireland, are making uh, their records available online, some free and some not. And genealogy groups and lectures. There's a bunch of good groups, probably some in the area aliens. So I will say this: once you get into it, it's dangerous. And you can throw out in the chat if you did some genealogy research and you found out things that nobody knew. there are skeletons in almost everybody's closets if we look deep enough. And sometimes it's said that it's funny if your great uncle was a horse thief, but it's not so funny if your dad is a car thief, right? That type of thing. A lot of older people are very reluctant to talk about anything that's embarrassing, and quite frankly, I know a few genealogists that got involved because the families wouldn't tell them what was going on, and that caused them to start researching it. Um, so you can see Ellis Island opened in 1892. Military papers are also very good. I found a lot about Oliver Anderson. In fact, he was shot at the Battle of the Bull Run, and I got his record sent from the U.S. Army uh, to me. Um, so when you go to track down your ancestors, one of the things you're going to probably do is have records that are easy to find and other records that are very hard to find. Um, and you work your way backwards most of the time, unless you have really good information about the 1800s or 1700s even. Um, so Lawrence Kennedy, this was Lawrence Aloysius Kennedy. He married Elizabeth Smith. That's my grandmother on December 31st, 1925. And uh, the records, that record has a couple of misprints and stuff. They may have been partying already because it was New Year's Eve and they had a reputation for partying. But since this was a 1925 record, it wasn't actually indexed until the 1926 films, the microfilms. And that took me a while to figure out, why can I not find this record? And it made no sense that a record 21 would be in 1925 if it's December. So you have to look for that and use the resources. Speak to the people at these research centers and libraries. They're often really good source of research. The National Archives in the third floor, where the Museum of the American Indian in New York City is free. Um, and the museum is free too. It's one of the Smithsonian Institutes, but it's down at Battery Park. So if you're in New York and you want to, I would stop there. They do have volunteers that help out. Fortunately, me, it's very close to my job, so sometimes I go to um, to lunch, and I'll spend 45 minutes over there. So it was his third marriage. Lawrence Aloysius was married four times. His first three wives passed away on him. Harry and Ruth Crecilius, who I actually knew, they passed away when I was quite young. But then my dad's uh, aunt and uncle, um, Ruth Crecilius, was actually Elizabeth Smith's sister, and it was at St. Michael's Church in New York City. Um, but the marriage certificate showed the parents, which was really, really helpful to me. And that's one of the ways I found Oliver Anderson, because his address was 139 Perry Street. And if you remember that record I showed before at the beginning, um, this was 37 Behune Street in New York City, which is very close to Perry Street. And the records right afterwards showed him moving to Perry Street. So that was really, really helpful to me. um, and the marriage certificate showed Perry Street. So I knew I had the right Oliver Anderson because his pension came to 139 Perry Street from the New York 79th Highlanders. So it was a little bit of investigation. I go and find my grandfather's marriage certificate, which points me to, and my grandmother's, who points me to my grandmother's parents and their address on Perry Street. And then I find the Civil War pension for Oliver Anderson living on Perry Street. So I knew it was him and not the Oliver Anderson um, that lives in Brooklyn. That drove me a little crazy. Oliver E. Anderson. So that's um, that's one of the things you want to do. You play detective and you match up things that were. So this is their marriage certificate. They were in Flushing, Queens. The Kennedys originally came to the United States and worked in Tuckahoe, New York. They were stonecutters, which was a skilled profession. There was a lot of marble quarries up in that area. Tuckahoe marble was well known at that time. Uh, and this also showed that Hugh Kennedy, whose name I knew, and Sarah Colden um, were uh, Lawrence Aloysius' parents. So it gave me a bunch of information that I didn't have before. And of course, then you start to search census records, military records for these other people. And that's how you do it. So, and this was a marriage certificate for Peter Smith and Elizabeth Oliver Smith. And the address was also 139 Perry Street, which is another way I found Oliver Anderson, who was the Civil War vet. I didn't know I had any Civil War vets. So you can see the surviving soldiers schedule, and this is at 129 Perry Street. So it was either misdone or removed because the records show both places to 139 Perry. There will be discrepancies, and sometimes a lot. People age 5 years between 10-year censuses. Some don't age at all. And one of the things is, especially back when the census taker would come to the door, it might be, a 10-year-old, and they don't know how old Aunt Sue, who lives with them, is, or their parents even, or their parents, or the neighbor, because not everybody's home. And so they give a best guess to the years. Some of the family stories you have will probably be incredibly accurate. You will find out, wow, that story I was told was just right, spot on. Uh, Everything I heard about that answer was right, and sometimes they'll be totally off. Uh, Cedric Hawkes, my mom thought he was born in Leeds, England, but he was actually born in Wisconsin. So he was not the first immigrant. In fact, that's one of the branches of my family that was actually here the longest. We didn't know that, and I found that his was a Spaniard, and I didn't know I had any Spaniards in the family. So um, this was the 1900 immigration record shows Oliver Anderson in May of 1858. Yeah, that's a little tough because is my Oliver Anderson that one that traveled on that boat? But as you start to match up records with things like immigration dates, and some of the census have them, and death certificates, how long this person had lived in it. But this death certificate also had Oliver Anderson's parents' name. An interesting one about William Anderson, his wife, is I found their records also, and it said that we're buried in New York Bay, and I thought to myself, "Oh my God, were they dumping people in New York Harbor? Were they dumping them in the Bay?" But actually, there's a New York Bay cemetery that was merged with another cemetery in New Jersey. So, um, uh, so I'm going to talk a little bit about professions. uh, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, and Butcher, Baker. A Chandler was a candlestick maker. And I'm going to show you a few ancestry records too that are kind of humorous. Um, my ancestors in Flushing, Queens, the most common profession on the page when they were in 1870 were farmer and farmhands, and that's Flushing, Queens. So this was a rural area. Um, Perry Street had a neighbor who was a fur polisher, um, and in the that area, Ireland and Germany or Prussia was the most common, but there was people from France, Scotland, Sweden, and Sarah Kennedy had 9 children for a living. We know that the mortality rate for kids was really high back then, so you will be shocked at how young some of your ancestors are having children and how many they had. Um, there was no television back then, and it wasn't streaming cogs. So, what did you do? Um, you made kids and raised kids, and sometimes of course kids were labor. A lot of my ancestors. This is my dad, Lawrence Kennedy, as well. He was a motion picture cameraman. He followed in his father's footsteps, and this is him on the set of Goldfinger, and that's Oddjob's hat. This was actually filmed down in Florida. So I I got lucky a few years ago. My brother saw that the Beatles. My father had worked the Beatles concert at Shea Stadium, and my brother saw some postings online because the Beatles anniversary, and lo and behold, there's a picture of my dad walking away from the stage with John, Paul, George, and Ringo behind him. So it was really nice to see that online. It's easy to find now, um, uh, that picture, but we never had documentary evidence. My dad had just told stories about different movies he worked on. He worked on a lot of good ones, and a lot of TV shows and a lot of sports events. Um, so 1930 census, we had a radio. This was one of the questions in the 1930 census, is whether um, people had radios. Um, some of these uh, some of these census records have different stuff, and some of them are really, really interesting. Some of them are so good because they'll tell you what year, whether you were native born and what year, how many children you had, what age you were at your first marriage, and Um, uh, that stuff is gold to a genealogy researcher. So, um, so some of the 19th century professions, we're going to look at these in a second. A mangler, that was someone who wringed wet clothes, usually using those rollers that we know of from the old buckets. Iceman was a common profession that existed well into the 20th century. The ice business was huge, and ice would even be brought down to the Caribbean islands, to places, Cuba and Puerto Rico. They would bring ice down there, and it was a business, both artificial ice and carved ice. Prostitute. Now, this is a profession that's existed virtually forever, um, as we know. Uh, and But in the 1880 census, it was listed as legal in some areas, and notably, if you look at San Francisco records, you see prostitutes are listed. Another one in San Francisco also, but not only in San Francisco, opium dealer. There were places where opium dealing was not only a listed profession, it was a legal profession. Um, and These two were listed, Chinatown and Chinese areas of San Francisco are exceptionally interesting for history researchers. Um, the the immigrants of Chinese, and I know some people who are paper cousins. They came, and you could bring a cousin in. There was an exclusion act to the Chinese. Um, you couldn't immigrate unless you already had somebody in your family who was uh, um, already in the United States. So they got paperwork from China that said they were cousins. This was an area of that was expanding a tremendous amount in the 1800s. From the gold rush on to the turn of the century, the San Francisco area was just. And I don't have ancestors out there. I was researching this more for historical reasons because history is interesting. A hostler or ostler was a person who took care of horses for guests at an inn. We don't really travel too much nowadays. But vermin destroyer is an actual job title you'll see record. And a nail cutter. One of my ancestors was a nail cutter. This is not somebody that works polishing nails and at the local salon. This is somebody who's making nails by hand. And one of them, Jacob Mickler, or Jacob Meckler, depending on the year you look. He was 14 years old or 12 years old when he was a nail cutter working in a nail manufacturing out in those iron mines I told you about, and a lamplighter. So I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to switch to another share, I think, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. Um, Let me just 1 second here, and let me see what screen I'm sharing here. I just want to make sure. Does anybody see that screen? Can you see that screen? Does anybody see the screen with the census record on it? I will move to another screen. There we go. Yeah, there it is. It takes a little time. There's a little delay, but you can see this was a nail cutter, um, right there. That was one of the professions. Um, and I'm going to show you a couple of things about ancestry now too. So let me close this one down, and I'm going to show you an actual search on ancestry. Um, and this is a lamplighter, by the way. This was a very common profession because these lamps were gas, and they were um, they were lit manually. Um, so this was a very important profession, and like many professions, this did last until into the 20th century. Of course, as things became less rural and more automated, and electricity came on board, fewer and fewer gas lamps were around. So I'm gonna shut this one down and switch over to ancestry. And here's an example of some of those professions. I'm just gonna, unfortunately, I have to stop and reshare a screen to get it to switch, I believe. And if we do this we do this again, I will practice more. So let me just take a quick look. Yeah. Uh, I hope you all can see that. Um, can anybody see this page? Um, you can see that this man was a seaman on a whaler. This was in Rhode Island, and um, of course, whaling was a huge profession. This is not related to me. These were just some of the records that I'd come across that I decided to bring. This person was a block cutter, and a block cutter was usually somebody who worked for a milliner. Those blocks were for hats. They would go and make blocks to fit hats. And this weekend, I know there's some felt stuff. I wonder if we're going to see some of those blocks. As you see before, this person was an iceman. And if you view the record, which may be hard to see on a small screen, especially if you're on a smartphone, uh, you can see how Ancestry groups these, and you can go down and show an index of the people in there, and it'll show you some of the information that's been cataloged. So this person was married. Their birth year was about 1830. Their house number, and their wife was in it. Usually, the census records have a head of family or head of household, and then all the people that lived in that household, regardless of the relatives or not. That's most of what the Ancestry.com does. So I'm going to show you a quick peek, and I'm just checking on time here. A quick peek at my tree, and I'm going to go to the Kennedy tree here, and I probably won't speak about DNA, but here's Joseph Meckler, who we saw before. One of the more interesting ones is, and I'm just going to go into uh, Kennedy. You can see I can look at people in my tree, and there's a bunch of Kennedys. I'm just going to switch to Lawrence Peter Kennedy. That was my dad. So here's my dad, my two brothers, my mom. I'm hoping you're seeing this, and his his father was Lawrence Aloysius. That's the newsreel cameraman. If you look here, you can see a closer picture of him um, working movie tone news. Um, One of the big events that he did cover, by the way, was the Hindenburg disaster. He's mentioned on the cover of the New York Times and in several newsreel related books, Lawrence Aloysius. And he was quite lucky because he and uh, his um, sound man, Leon DeTitta Jr., it was raining, pouring that day when the Hindenburg in Lakehurst, New Jersey, went up in flames. And he had taken his jacket off to cover his camera. They were literally below the Hindenburg itself. And the newspaper articles and the accounts given by some of the other crew that were there um, mentioned that they had seen the tail of the Hindenburg go right over the top of them. But they kept filming until it started to collapse on them, and then they had to run. And they got some of the best shots. Although Al Gold, who's another well-known newsreel cameraman, was the only one to get credit. He mentions that my grandfather Lawrence Aloysius got some of the best shots. Um, and I will go right back to a search, and I'm going to show you a basic ancestry search here. So if you have an ancestor, and you can get a trial for this, by the way, I have an active subscription now, but I usually let it lapse, and then when they're running a promotion for half price, I renew my subscription because I work out all the records and I don't really have too much new stuff. Um, but for example, if I wanted to search for Lawrence Aloysius Kennedy, I would put in his name here, and if he's already in my tree, I can just select him, right? Otherwise, if I'm searching a totally different person, I wouldn't select all this information. And I can hit search. Now, you might have to look under Larry Kennedy, might have to look under Lawrence A. This is actually my tree, but if you look at census and voter records, um, see, there's a Lawrence Kennedy in England. This is not my relative, right? So you can see there's a lot of records here. So one of the things you can do on Ancestry is I can say, well, I want somebody who was born in New York, and you can say how close you want it to be, exact or adjacent states. And this collection, because I was doing research earlier, is for England, which is probably why all these Englishmen are coming up. But I could say all collections, or I can say United States. Now, you may or may not have access to them depending on what subscription you have. There is a US subscription, there's a world subscription. Um, but and you can see there are some other Kennedys here. Mary A, Lawrence A. So I can also scroll to here and say, no, I want, exact and similar to Lawrence. And one of the reasons you might want to go very broad at first, um, and this is not my ancestor either, you may want to go very broad at first, is because um, the search tool will find it as depending on how detailed you want, how broad and exact you want. Um, and I'll even edit it and take out the Aloysius because a lot of these records are not going to have his middle name or middle initial. All right, so I might just search under Lawrence Kennedy and the birth year. All right. So um, one of the things about searching that birth year is I don't have to put 1896. It can be broad, or I can choose within 10 years, within 5 years. I usually do within 2 or 5 years. And the reason why is that records are often wrong, or Ancestry doesn't know what part of the year they were born in. So they try to do their best. All right. So now, if I want to, and none of these ancestors are mine, by the way, um, none of these ancestors are mine, but I can go and say lived in Williston Park and narrow it down. He did live in Williston Park and Mineola. My ancestors lived on Park Avenue. Now you could see no records came up, and this is one of the limitations on Ancestry. Uh, Sometimes you'll have a good match and you won't find anybody. Um, and I'm doing this search just to show people who might want to use it that you have to choose your filters and you have to update to which collections you want to search. And the reason why is it's limited. Um, it does its best job and it's getting better and better, but the record keeping and the searches aren't not perfect yet. Right, so you can see that these people are New York State Census. All right. Um, you can also choose which census you want. So I can go down and say, okay, I want the United States, and then I want censuses from the 1900s. And I'm going to show you another trick, by the way, in a little while. All right. And then I want, if I look under the 1900s, I can see that there are New York State Census is 95, New York State Census this, and there's going to be census from the federal censuses. They come out every 10 years. Um, the So if I go broad and I go broad here and I update it, uh, it should give me additional census options here. So you can see there's the New York State, the Minnesota territory records. I don't have ancestors there. But one of the other records that's going to be very helpful to you if you lived in the United States, or your ancestors did, is the um, different federal census. And I usually start there with the federal census. People move, and you may not even know that they moved. So there's an example of the search. But you can see after amount of time, I found his record in the 1900 census, the 1910 census, 1920, 1930. This is the first one my dad's in. And this is a very interesting one to me um, from a personal standpoint. And the reason it is that Harry and Ruth Crecilius, um, Harry and Ruth Crecilius, they were on that marriage record you saw before. If you can see here, they were actually living in the same household as the Kennedys. Here's Harry and Ruth, and it was scribbled out, and then a little note was put on the side that said that they moved to Williston Park, which is a town on Long Island where my dad moved. They moved right after Harry and Ruth in 1930. So my dad was born in Flushing. So you can see this is Elizabeth Smith. Uh, that's the mom. There's Ray Smith, Elizabeth Smith, my grandmother. So this is my great grandmother. Ray Smith was my dad's uncle. Elizabeth Smith was their daughter, who became Elizabeth Kennedy. uh, Lawrence Aloysius. And that's one thing to note as you do track down your ancestors, especially for women. Uh, if they're married and you know their married name, don't put them in an ancestry tree with their married name. You always want the birth name and using a married name or there's ways to put down alias and what they go by. Always start out with their birth name. Um, and the software is getting better and better at things like that. So you can add somebody to the tree. So this was a really interesting one to me. Um, and another one that was really quite interesting to me was some Canadian records, which were written in French from one of my ancestors who my mom had told me about. And to find records for baptism records in the 1820s in French was really exciting in Canada. And then eventually they moved down to Troy, New York, and then New York City. So this let me know to look for Harry and Ruth in Williston Park as well. And even though I have them here, maybe some of that information was more accurate. You can see that Harry was 26 when he married, and Ruth was 22. And that leads itself to a funny story. One of the reasons you might want to do ancestry is when my father passed away, he was being buried at Mount St. Mary's Cemetery in Queens. Um, we got there, and my brother was very upset, and some of our friends were saying, "Hey, Larry's really upset." My brother's also in Lawrence. You want to go to speak to him? They didn't want my mom to find out, And I said to Larry, "So well, what's wrong?" He's like, I think they're burying him in the wrong grave." So I said, "What?" He goes, "I think they're burying Dad in the wrong grave." I said, "No, no, they're not." And he said, "Yeah, yeah. The tombstone reads it's Smith. It says Smith on it." I said, "Oh yeah, yeah. Grandma, Elizabeth Kennedy, who died in the '40s, so we never knew her, was a Smith." And he's like, "Oh really?" Yeah. I said her dad had bought this. Um, Her dad had bought this. And I don't know why, by the way, I see my screen glitches once in a while. If you're seeing that, I apologize. Why it glitches, I don't know. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare again. Um, so that's one of the reasons you may want to do that, because my brother was pretty sure that they were putting my dad in the wrong grave, but I had already taken interest in um, genealogy, so I knew that this was actually the right grave, and you can see that this was actually born Elizabeth Smith, and her mom, whose married name was Elizabeth Smith. So fortunately, they did bury my dad in the right place. The tombstone still says Smith. I haven't ever gone to update that. So, um, and by the way, if anybody has any questions, they can throw them out in the chat, and I'll see if I can answer them. I'm going to scroll back a little bit um, to see if there are any questions. The cogs ones I can't help you with. Um, Yes, and yes, G Lee, that is the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle, genealogy. Um, and yeah, Sakura, it is fascinating. I will tell you one story. There was a guy, last name is Titus, and I was looking at a railroad event out in Pennsylvania. Um, and Ron Titus, and I found out he was running. Well, we have some Tituses in the family tree, so I sent them an email saying, "Hey, Ron, I'm interested in this train event you have for the old trains out there. But any chance you're related to these Tituses?" And he goes, "Yeah," and he knew my godfather and godmother who had retired out there just before they passed. And he sent me a whole family tree from my mother's grand aunt Lottie's Bible. And it gave me so much information. So it was like one email got me 15 pieces of information with 15 people and where they're buried. Um, so the so yes, do ask questions, and it is. Um, I will tell some because somebody asked some sketchy family stories. My mom had always heard that um, her father, Cedric Ogden Hawkes, which is another great name, Cedric Ogden Hawkes had made the cover. She heard from her aunt Millie that he made the cover of the Staten Island Advance, being arrested and, on the courthouse steps. So I I searched for his name in the New York Times, Cedric Hawkes, Cedric O. Hawkes, Cedric Ogden Hawkes, and lo and behold, I find that during the Depression, the early 1930s, there's a um, New York Times article about Cedric Hawkes and his two brothers getting arrested. they were bond brokers and stockbrokers during the Depression, and they were selling worthless stock. They lived in Staten Island. Um, so I found that article which confirmed it. So I worked downtown New York, and I knew that the St. George branch of the New York Public Library on Staten Island had the Staten Island Advance on microfilm. So I took the ferry out there. I walked up there. I went to use a microfilm, and I found that on the microfilm, the same date as the New York Times article, is a article about Hawks brothers get arrested, and they're all smiling. They don't seem upset about it. And the first picture I'd ever seen of my grandfather um, was on the cover of Staten Island Vans getting arrested. He's turned away in the picture, but they have an insert picture with him on it. And that was kind of fun. So I called my mom up and said, "Listen, I did find your dad." I also found through genealogy research cousins of mine on that part of the family tree that were from Virginia, but they moved to New York. And one of them, one of my cousins, she lived 2 blocks from my job downtown Manhattan. Um, 2 blocks from Manhattan, and we become friends. And we compared some stories, and she had some really good ones from her grandfather, which my grandfather's brother, because my grandfather died in the 30s. So my mom never really knew the family. The families didn't talk. There was a lot of animosity, and he died when she was very, very young. So, and then she moved into Brooklyn and lived with her uncle Joe, one of the two Joes I'm named after. So on one side, I had information about movie tone newsreel cameraman, my dad doing all these movies like Goldfinger and 12 Angry Men and covering the Mets and Funny Girl and Hello Dolly and all these other great movies and pictures that my dad had collected of his father. Um, and his grandfather was a stonecutter, so my dad used to joke his grandfather was a chiseler. Um, the um, but it was really interesting. I will warn you, though, there are skeletons in closets, and I'm going to briefly go over because we're about to wrap up some stuff about family DNA. And if anybody has gotten their DNA done, um, they can put in the chat that they've gotten their DNA done. I did mine. I recommend you think about it a lot before you do it. And one of the reasons is once it's out there, it's out there. Um, and um, I'm going to just jump over to ancestries. I did ancestries. There's also a bunch of others like 23andMe. Um, but I'm going to show you my DNA results. Um, so, and how ancestry handles that. So, if you look at the DNA story, the ethnicity estimate, this is a best guess. You cannot go at this is not rock solid, and they're updating it. So I became more Irish between two of them. So at one point they estimated that I was uh, 75% Irish and Scottish, and uh, now I'm 85%. But this is a best guess. They do it based on groups. So you may have ancestry that never shows up here. I know there are some Germans in the tree. I know there's some people in England in the tree. And this is a best guess, but it's a good one, and ethnicity is a little poorly defined, but these also kind of tell you the regions that your family is most likely from. None of these came as huge surprises to me because I have a Irish on both sides. And the only one that came up surprising to me, and that was not on DNA, was Spaniard. So I'll show you the DNA matches and how it does it. Um, and you can see this is my mom, and she also did it. My cousin Tammy sent me a kit for her too. Um, and somebody said my brother did DNA and ancestry, so I figured wasn't going to be much more info out in the world that hadn't already. Yeah, that's true. You can even have two siblings that come up with different percentage ethnicities because we don't get all of our DNA equally from both parents, and they didn't get it from both parents. So you can have mixes and matches there. Um, but uh, these are second cousins, some of whom I knew existed, some of whom I didn't. These are cousins I found through Ancestry, and they've done it since. So this is on my mom's side. So I know my mom's definitely my mom. I told my mom, "Hey, mom, I checked, and I'm related to some of those hawks and some of the people in the Tituses. So, um, yeah. So you're my mom. I didn't switch me at the hospital. I can't testify as to my brothers. They haven't done theirs yet. And my dad's my dad because some of those cousins showed up as well. But you can see that they try to estimate what it is, your third, fourth cousin. This is not perfect, by the way. Um, this is not perfect. I know, for example, that a few of these people listed second or third cousins are definitely second cousins or third cousins, and some people are listed a little closer. It's a best guess. Some of the people have their own family tree, like Megan O'Brien. I don't think we found a match to each other. Oh yeah, this is it. She's a descendant of Hugh Maxwell Kennedy as well, the one that was a stonecutter. Right. So that's kind of nice because now I've been able to use her to branch off to other places. And sometimes you will have better information, um, and sometimes you won't. I've helped people out. I did get a message from a guy who was another Kennedy and said, "Listen, despite my Kennedy name, we're not um, related, but you are related to my half sister." So his mom had some fun in the '60s, and she thought that one of the Kennedys was both of their parents, but it turned out genetically that only one of them was. So I helped his sister out to link up how we're um, related. But there are definitely ghosts in those closets. So I would think twice and three times, um, and before you do your DNA, or even if you start peeking in those walls, I find it incredibly interesting. There's always one more thing to research. Um, and like I said, I would start with the free sites. I'll put them up again in case anybody wants them. But if you want to email me, you can email me at josephrkennedy@yahoo.com and say, what do you recommend? And I'll share some of the information. So let me bring that screen back up if I can, the PowerPoint. And I'll stop this share and then switch over to the PowerPoint share. And I'll get you some of the places that are some of the resources that are exceptionally good, and the two places that are really, really quite good, um, to start, especially if in the New York City area. By the way, most of the libraries in the New York area have free ancestry subscriptions, library subscriptions. So if you want to start out, I would say go to your local library, see if they have an ancestry subscription. All the New York public libraries do that I know of. And you can go and research and do familysearch.org. New York City, there's the Municipal Archives, the National Archives, the New York Historical Society. Uh, be careful, by the way, of bad websites. Like we know, there's a lot of bad sites out there. They're gonna put a generic thing out there, find about your family tree and the name Spengler, and you're thinking, oh well, maybe I'll find out I'm related to Egon Spengler, and you'll go and find out that they're charging you for records that are easily available anywhere else and charging you a lot, or they're not really up to date. So there are sites out there. Cindy's List, by the way, and Cindy's spelled with a Y. If you Google Cindy's List, this one here, this is an exceptional list of genealogy resources. I mean, really comprehensive list of genealogy resources that you want to check out. Once again, I'm going to go try to top the some of the and show uh, some of the sites that are really quite good. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. So these are the ones I would start out with. Family Search. They got a lot of good records. They got a lot of censuses. These are free. And then I would also, once you've got some information from your families, do some information with your relatives, your mother, your father, your aunts, uncles, cousins. I have a cousin who's older than me. He knows quite a bit more about those relatives. Um, some of the relatives. Uh, get some of that information down first. And I'm sorry, I don't know why that keeps blanking out. Get some of that information down first uh, before you start to pay for a service. Family ancestry, I usually do 6 months at a shot. You can do longer. Um, what do you call it? Uh, you can do longer. but I would say start out with 6 months and you can get some really good information out of there. But do your due diligence first. You wanna have information going in so that, you get your best bang for your buck, because it can be time consuming. And I'm gonna say bye now. I think we next we have Mr. Cornsman coming up, which would be really, really good. Is, Jeremiah next on our list? So maybe our friend Diana I can end this meeting. I can end it as well, the Zoom, but I don't wanna cancel out until she says so. Let me see if she's messaged me. Just give me a second here. Um, no, okay. So, um, she can shut me down when she wants. Um, okay, she's giving me the thumbs up, and, and we're gonna go over to the T-Czar and learn to cook with the T-Czar.